All right, so we're ready to jump into This Book May Save Your Life by Dr. Karan Rajan. This deep dive, it's all about the human body,
Yeah.
exploring the amazing things it can do, but also like those self-destructive tendencies we all have. I got to say, what really grabbed me about this book was how Dr. Rajan, he just blends humor and science,
hmm
makes all these complex medical ideas understandable and actually really entertaining.
Yeah, his background as a surgeon, it really comes through in this book. The way he mixes personal stories with medical insights, it just highlights how complicated and fragile our bodies are.
For sure. Like, he kicks things off by talking about his time in medical school,
Mm.
dissecting cadavers and finally understanding how intricate our anatomy is.
hmm
And then, bam, he talks about this patient who collapsed from a ruptured appendix. And it just hits you like this incredible machine we live in can break down, just like that.
It's such a contrast, right? The dissection room is so controlled, and then in emergency, it's all chaos. I think it reminds us that even with all our medical progress, we're still vulnerable.
Absolutely. And speaking of vulnerable, the gut. All right. I mean, who would have guessed that we actually start as, get this, an embryonic anus?
Oh, it's true. It's a pretty wild part of how embryos develop. That first opening, the blastopore, it eventually becomes, kind of a funny thought that even complex life starts from that.
It really makes you think. And from that, humble beginning, we get this whole digestive system. Dr. Rajan, he really goes deep into the gut microbiome, which is like trillions of bacteria that live inside us. It's crazy to think this microscopic community, it processes our food, it impacts our mood, and it even plays a part in our immune system.
Oh, definitely. And he talks about the gut-brain axis. It's this communication highway between our gut and our brain. And he suggests that imbalances in our gut bacteria, well, those can lead to all sorts of health problems.
There's this one story about Dr. William Beaumont, this surgeon who experimented on a patient who had a hole in his stomach. I know ethically it's kind of messy, but those experiments, they actually taught us so much about digestion.
It's true. It's a controversial part of medical history. But his work, it helped us understand things like stomach acid, how strong it is, and how our bodies protect themselves from it.
I mean, he even observed how stomach acid can dissolve metal.
Yeah.
How is it that our own bodies handle that kind of power?
Well, our stomach lining, it's got this layer of mucus that shields it from the acid, but that protection, it can be weakened by things like stress, medications like NSAIDs, even certain bacteria. Dr. Rajan, he lays it all out.
And speaking of NSAIDs, those over-the-counter pain relievers, those can increase your risk of ulcers, right?
Exactly. See, NSAIDs, they mess with the production of these compounds called prostaglandins, and those actually help protect the stomach lining. So while NSAIDs can relieve pain in the short term, using them for a long time, well, it can be bad news for your stomach.
Okay, so the stomach does its thing, and we move on to the liver and gallbladder. The liver, it makes bile, and then the gallbladder stores it. But sometimes things go wrong, and you get those pesky gallstones.
Oh, gallstones, those are super common. And Dr. Rajan, he talks about this from his own surgical experience. They can cause a lot of pain and even bigger problems if a stone blocks the bile duct. That can even lead to the pancreas getting inflamed.
The pancreas seems to be a pretty sensitive organ. Dr. Rajan even mentions pancreatic cancer and how dangerous it is because the symptoms, they often don't show up until it's already pretty advanced.
That's the tricky part. Early on, there aren't many noticeable symptoms, and by the time it's caught, well, it's often spread, and that makes treatment a lot harder.
So we break down food in the stomach, we deal with bile, and then we're on to the intestines, the small and the large intestines. Small intestine, it's all about absorbing nutrients. The large intestine, that's our waste processing center.
Right, the small intestine with all those tiny villi, it's amazingly efficient at grabbing those nutrients. And the large intestine, that's where we manage fluids and, well, get rid of what we don't need anymore.
Dr. Rajan, he even challenges the idea that the appendix is just useless, like some evolutionary leftover. He suggests that maybe it acts as a safe house for beneficial bacteria, so it can help repopulate the gut after a bout of, diarrhea.
Yeah, a lot of people think it's just vestigial, but some new research suggests it might play a role in our immune system. Reminds us that we're still figuring out how the body really works, even today.
He tells this pretty funny story about how he used a flatus tube to help a patient who had some bowel distension.
Oh, that's a classic example of how medicine sometimes requires, well, let's say creative solutions. Basically, it's a tube you insert to relieve gas buildup.
Mm.
Not glamorous, but hey, it gets the job done.
And the book, it doesn't shy away from the, shall we say, less glamorous parts of our biology. We get into the world of, well, poop, the Bristol stool chart, and even how those modern toilets we all use, They might be messing with our bowel health. Who would have thought the way we poop could be so important?
Yeah, he argues that our modern toilets, while they're great for sanitation, they've changed how we poop. And that can lead to more strain and pressure, which might contribute to things like hemorrhoids.
Amazing how something so basic can have such a big impact. But let's move on from, well, and focus on the brain, our command center.
The brain, huh? The organ that named itself. It's so complex, but
Yes.
as Dr. Rajan points out, it's got its quirks and its weaknesses, just like any other part of us.
He calls it a flawed operating system, like it can have glitches and errors in its programming, and he debunks that whole myth about being left-brained or right-brained.
Right, the idea that one side dominates, just not true. Both sides work together for, like, everything we do.
He even mentions how, after Einstein died, they studied his brain. And even looking at the brain of such a genius, they couldn't really figure out, you know, the secrets of intelligence.
Exactly. The brain, it's still a big mystery in a lot of ways. We've learned a lot about its structure and how it works, but things like consciousness, intelligence, we're still figuring that out.
And it's not just about intelligence. He talks about this case where a patient, a young kid, took a minor fall, and it caused bleeding in the brain. It really highlights how fragile our brains can be.
Even small head injuries can have big consequences. The skull offers protection, but the brain inside, it's still very delicate and susceptible to damage. It really makes you think about protecting your brain, right?
Luckily, Dr. Rajan gives us some tips on that. He talks about how important nutrition is, like things like iron, vitamin D, omega-3 fatty acids. Those are key for our brains to work right.
He even gets into long COVID and how it can affect the brain. I mean, that's been a big concern lately. And it's kind of scary to think a virus could have such a lasting impact on how our brains work.
Long COVID, it's a real puzzle. We're still learning about it, but we're starting to see how it can have neurological consequences. Just adds another layer of complexity to the whole thing.
And then there's brain fog. Ugh,
Mm.
we've all been there. That feeling of being mentally slow, can't focus. Dr. Rajan, he points to a bunch of things that can cause it. Stress, not getting enough sleep, even being socially isolated. Brain fog, it's a common complaint, and it can really mess with your day-to-day life. But addressing those underlying issues like stress, sleep, and social interaction, that can help improve how your brain works.
One of the coolest things he talks about is neuroplasticity. I mean, it's wild to think that our brains can actually change and adapt throughout our lives. Even as we get older, we can still learn new things, pick up new skills, and basically give our brains a boost.
Neuroplasticity is amazing. It means our brains aren't just static, they're constantly evolving based on what we experience. It has huge implications for how we learn, form memories, even recover from brain injuries.
Makes you wonder, how do we keep our brains sharp and working at their best? Dr. Rajan, he emphasizes physical activity, being social, and constantly learning new things. Basically, give your brain a good workout.
An active lifestyle, mentally and physically, that's key for maintaining a healthy brain. Doing things that challenge us intellectually, being around other people, it keeps our brains flexible and ready to learn.
It's incredible how connected our physical and mental well-being are. Each affects the other. But let's switch gears for a minute and talk about the heart. This organ that works nonstop, but it's also vulnerable in so many ways.
It's a marvel, isn't it? The way it just keeps beating, pumping blood throughout our lives.
Hmm.
But it's not invincible. Dr. Rajan, he talks about everything from plaque buildup in the arteries to something called broken heart syndrome.
He tells this gripping story about treating a patient who went into cardiac arrest. It's a race against time to get their heart beating again. It just shows you how quickly things can go south, even with an organ as strong as the heart.
Cardiac arrest, it's a life or death situation. It needs immediate action. Dr. Rajan's story, it emphasizes how important it is to know CPR and how crucial defibrillation is for restarting a heart that's stopped.
And it's interesting how many ways the heart can have problems. Plaque in the arteries that restricts blood flow, increases the risk of heart attacks and strokes. And then you have this thing where extreme emotions can actually hurt your heart.
Yeah, broken heart syndrome, it's not as well known, but it's a real thing, triggered by severe emotional stress. And it can feel like a heart attack, but it's actually the heart muscle weakening temporarily.
It really shows how connected our physical and emotional states are. All right, so enough heartbreak. Let's talk about keeping our hearts healthy. Dr. Rajan, he's got some good advice on that.
Keeping your heart in good shape, it involves multiple things. Dr. Rajan, he stresses managing blood pressure through diet, exercise, and sometimes medication, and he digs into cholesterol and how it affects the heart, too.
Cholesterol, it can be confusing. The whole good cholesterol versus bad cholesterol thing. It's hard to know which foods are good for you and which ones are going to clog your arteries.
Right. Cholesterol, it's important for certain things in the body, but too much of the bad kind, the LDL, that's what builds up in your arteries and puts you at risk for heart disease. Dr. Rajan, he advocates for a healthy diet and lifestyle to keep that cholesterol balanced.
He also looks at the link between blood sugar and heart health. Reminds us that all these different aspects of our health are connected.
High blood sugar, especially for long periods, it damages blood vessels, and that raises your risk of heart disease. Managing your blood sugar, whether it's through lifestyle changes or medication, that's key for your overall cardiovascular health.
So we've covered the gut, the brain, the heart. Now let's breathe deep and talk about the lungs, those unsung heroes of respiration. We often take them for granted until, of course, we have trouble breathing.
The lungs are essential for keeping us alive, right? They let us exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide so our cells can function, but they're surprisingly delicate. Dr. Rajan, he talks about all the things that can affect them, from infections and allergies to the simple act of choking.
There's this story he tells about treating a patient with a collapsed lung, a pneumothorax. It shows how serious these situations can be and how quickly you need medical help.
A collapsed lung, basically air leaks into the space between your lung and chest wall. It can happen from an injury, an underlying condition, or sometimes even spontaneously.
Crazy how something as basic as breathing can get messed up like that. Makes you appreciate how complex our respiratory system is and how important it is to keep those lungs healthy.
And the lungs, they do more than just exchange air. They help regulate the pH of our blood, they filter out harmful stuff, and they even contribute to our immune system.
But they're also really vulnerable to things getting in, like bacteria, viruses, allergens, even bits of food that go down the wrong pipe.
To fight off these invaders, our respiratory system has a bunch of defenses, mucus, cilia, and all those immune cells. But Dr. Rajan points out that those defenses, they can be overwhelmed, and that's when we get infections, allergic reactions, and all sorts of breathing problems.
The COVID-19 pandemic, it really showed us how important mechanical ventilation can be. It highlighted the need for good breathing support, especially in critical care situations.
Mechanical ventilation, it can be a lifesaver for people who can't breathe on their own. But it's complicated and comes with risks. Dr. Rajan emphasizes that we need more innovation in this area to improve things for patients.
So we talked about healthy lungs, but what about the framework that holds it all together? The skeleton. We often forget about our bones. We think of them as, I don't know, just inert structures.
Bones are far from inert. They're living tissue. They're constantly remodeling and adapting to the stresses we put on them. They give us structure, they protect our organs, they even store important minerals.
Dr. Rajan, he marvels at the design of the hip joint with its ball and socket structure, giving us all that range of motion. But then there's the knee joint, and that seems to have a lot more problems.
The knee, it's a masterpiece of engineering, but it goes through so much wear and tear. It depends on ligaments and muscles for stability, which makes it prone to injury, especially for athletes.
He talks about the ACL, that ligament in the knee that people tear all the time. It's amazing how hard it is to repair because it doesn't get a lot of blood flow.
ACL tears, those are common sports injuries, and they can really limit your mobility. Often you need surgery to fix it and then a long rehab process.
Dr. Rajan, he gives some good tips on how to strengthen our knees. Balance exercises, regular physical activity. It's a reminder that we can take steps to protect our joints and prevent future problems.
Maintaining a healthy weight, exercising regularly, and focusing on good form when you're active, all that can help lower your risk of knee injuries.
And speaking of wear and tear, let's talk about our feet. We're constantly on them, but we rarely give them the attention they deserve.
Our feet, they're complicated structures. Bones, muscles, tendons, ligaments, they work together to absorb impact and keep us stable when we move.
Dr. Rajan, he gets into the whole debate about minimalist shoes and whether they're good for our feet. It's interesting to think that the shoes we wear can affect how our feet function and our overall health.
Yeah, minimalist shoes, they're controversial. Some people say that traditional shoes, with all their cushioning and support, actually weaken our foot muscles and change how we walk.
He also talks about posture and how important it is, not just for our backs, but for our whole skeleton. The way we hold ourselves, it affects everything.
Our spines, they're meant to support our weight and allow us to move in all sorts of ways. But bad posture, it puts extra stress on our spine. And that can lead to pain, stiffness, and even long-term damage.
Good posture. It's not just about standing up straight. It's about being aware of how you're holding your body when you're sitting, standing, moving around. Little adjustments, they can make a big difference.
Ergonomics, how we interact with our work environment, that's becoming more and more important as we spend more time sitting at desks and looking at screens.
So we've explored the scaffolding of our bodies. Now let's turn our attention to the windows to the world, our eyes. Get ready for some mind-bending illusions and some surprising truths about how we see.
Our eyes are pretty amazing. They take light and convert it into signals that our brains interpret as images. But what we see, it's not always an accurate representation of what's actually out there.
It's crazy, right? He explains how human vision, it's a construction of the brain, not just a direct reflection of reality.
The brain processes all the visual information it gets, filling in gaps and creating a smooth visual experience. It shows how much the brain influences how we see the world.
He breaks down the whole visual process, from light entering the eye to what the retina does, to the fact that our brains actually flip the image we see. Think about it, our visual reality is upside down.
The retina at the back of the eye, it has these special cells, rods, and cones that detect light and turn it into signals. Those signals travel to the brain through the optic nerve, where they're processed.
He talks about the macula, that little spot in the retina that gives us sharp central vision. And Dr. Rajan, he points out how vulnerable it is, especially to age-related macular degeneration, a leading cause of vision loss.
The macula, it's what lets us see detail, like when we read or recognize faces. Macular degeneration, it affects that area specifically, and it causes blurry or distorted central vision.
It just goes to show how important it is to take care of our eyes and get regular checkups, especially as we get older. Dr. Rajan also explores the limitations of our peripheral vision and how our brains compensate for those blind spots we all have.
Our peripheral vision, it's not as detailed as our central vision, but the brain, it combines information from both, creating a complete picture of what's around us.
He even talks about saccades, those tiny eye movements we make without even realizing it. They're constantly scanning our environment, picking up visual information, even when we think we're staring at one thing.
Saccades, they're essential for things like reading and driving. Those quick movements let us focus on different parts of a scene, so we're always updating what we see.
Dr. Rajan, he gets into how we focus, the role of those eye muscles, and how refractive errors like nearsightedness and farsightedness can happen. It's wild to think that small differences in the shape of our eyes and how those muscles work, it can affect how clearly we see.
The cornea and lens, they work together to focus light onto the retina. Nearsightedness, or myopia, that's when the eye is too long, so light focuses in front of the retina. Farsightedness, or hyperopia, that's when the eye is too short, so light focuses behind the retina.
And he talks about how nearsightedness is becoming more common, especially in kids. He blames modern lifestyles, spending too much time indoors and staring at screens. All that can change the shape of our eyes over time.
Myopia, it's definitely on the rise. Genes play a role, but environmental factors like doing a lot of close-up work and not being outside enough, those seem to be big contributors.
He even tells this fascinating story about how, during World War II, the British government used the myth about carrots to hide their radar technology. Kind of crazy how even something as innocent as a vegetable can get tangled up in, national security.
The idea that eating carrots helps you see better at night, it became popular during World War II. Carrots do have vitamin A, which is good for your eyes, but the British government, they used that misinformation to cover up the real reason their pilots could see so well at night: radar.
Shows how easily misinformation can spread, even if it's about something harmless like a carrot. But let's switch gears again and talk about another sense: smell. Get ready for some surprising revelations about how our noses work and how tricky smells can be.
Smell, it's a chemical sense. It relies on receptors in our noses to detect those odor molecules. And it's a powerful sense. It triggers memories, affects our emotions, even warns us of danger.
He goes through the whole process, how odor molecules waft into our noses, activate those olfactory receptors, and send signals to the brain. It's amazing how sensitive our noses are and how many different smells we can detect.
The olfactory system, the part that controls our sense of smell, it's incredibly complex. We have millions of those olfactory receptors in our nasal cavities, each one designed to identify specific odor molecules.
And get this, the olfactory system can actually regenerate itself. That's pretty rare in the nervous system. It means that people who lose their sense of smell, they might be able to regain it.
The olfactory receptor neurons, those are the cells in our noses that can regenerate throughout our lives. It's different from a lot of other neurons in our nervous system, which don't have that ability.
The human body's ability to adapt is amazing. But Dr. Rajan, he points out that our sense of smell, it's not as good as some animals. We can't smell as well as a dog, for example, and we don't really use it for navigation.
Humans, we rely more on our sight and hearing to get around, but our sense of smell, it's still important. It influences what we eat, our social interactions, even our overall well-being.
And he points out how tricky smells can be. He uses the example of how the same fragrant compounds that can be found in flowers and, well, feces shows how what we find pleasant or unpleasant, it's really subjective and depends on the context.
Our perception of smell, it's shaped by all sorts of things. Our experiences, our culture, even our mood at the moment. Something that one person loves, another person might hate.
It reminds us that our senses, they can be unreliable, and what we perceive can be easily influenced by outside factors. But let's move on from the nose and talk about another sensory powerhouse, the tongue.
The tongue, with its taste buds, lets us experience different flavors and textures. But Dr. Rajan explains that it does more than just taste. It helps us speak, chew, and swallow.
And don't forget, it can tell us about our overall health.
Definitely. If your tongue changes in appearance or how it feels, it could be a sign of an underlying medical condition. Pay attention to anything unusual and see a doctor if you need to.
Dr. Rajan goes through the 5 basic tastes: sweet, sour, salty, bitter, and umami, that savory taste.
Yeah.
And he talks about why we're naturally drawn to sugary and fatty foods. It all goes back to evolution.
Our taste preferences are rooted in our evolutionary history. Those sweet and fatty foods, they were scarce and a good source of energy. But now they're everywhere, and if we eat too much, well, it can lead to health problems.
It's like a constant battle between our instincts and the abundance of food choices we have nowadays. Dr. Rajan also shows how our other senses, like smell and sound, they actually affect how we taste things.
Our senses work together to create a multisensory experience. Like the smell of food can make it taste stronger, and the sound of crunching can change how we perceive its texture.
He even introduces us to taste illusions, using the miracle berry as an example. This little fruit, it can actually make sour things taste sweet for a while.
The miracle berry, it has this protein called miraculin that binds to our taste receptors, and when you eat it before sour food, it changes how those receptors perceive sourness, so it tastes sweet instead.
Crazy how a simple berry can trick our taste buds like that. But let's shift from taste to a sense that doesn't get enough credit: touch.
Touch, it's maybe our most intimate sense. It lets us experience the world through physical sensations. But it's more than just feeling pressure or temperature. Dr. Rajan explains that it involves this whole network of receptors in our skin detecting all sorts of stimuli.
And he says that touch, it's actually an illusion created by our brains as they interpret those signals from our skin. It shows that how we experience reality, it's not just about what our senses pick up, but also how our brain interprets it.
Our skin has all these different receptors, each one specialized to detect different types of touch. Pressure, vibration, temperature, pain. They send signals to the brain through the spinal cord.
In our skin, it's not just this passive covering. Dr. Rajan emphasizes how important it is as a protective barrier. It regulates our body temperature, and it's even connected to our immune system.
Our skin is our largest organ, and it does so much to protect us from the outside world. It's our first line of defense against infection, it helps control our internal temperature, and it even produces vitamin D when we're in the sun.
He talks about the skin microbiome,
Yeah.
all the microorganisms that live on our skin. It's crazy to think that we're covered in bacteria, but most of them are harmless or even good for us.
The skin microbiome, it's like a little ecosystem on our skin that contributes to skin health. These microorganisms help fight off infections, maintain the skin's pH, and even influence our body odor.
Dr. Rajan explores using microbiota transplants to treat skin conditions like acne and eczema. It shows how much we're learning about the relationship between our bodies and the microbes that live on us.
Microbiota transplants, it's basically transferring good microorganisms from a healthy person to someone with a skin problem. It's still experimental, but it shows promise for treating different skin disorders.
He also challenges the way we think about cleanliness. He suggests that being too clean, too hygienic, it might actually mess with the balance of our skin microbiome.
Maintaining good hygiene is definitely important to prevent infections, but washing too much and using harsh soaps, that can strip away our skin's natural oils, and that upsets the balance of our skin microbiome.
It's a reminder that we need to be balanced with our skincare routine. Choose gentle products that support our skin's natural defenses. Dr. Rajan gives some practical advice on skincare, emphasizing cleansing, moisturizing, and protecting our skin from the sun.
A good skincare routine, it doesn't have to be complicated. Gentle cleansing, moisturizing, and sun protection, that's key for healthy skin. Choose products that work for your skin type and avoid harsh ingredients that can irritate your skin.
All right, so we've explored our outermost layer. Now let's get into something that's often considered taboo: sex and reproduction. Get ready for some surprising insights into the challenges and vulnerabilities of both the male and female reproductive systems.
Reproduction is how our species continues, but it comes with risks and potential complications. Dr. Rajan, he's very open and informative in his discussion of the male and female reproductive systems. He talks about their weaknesses and why preventative care is so important.
He starts with the male reproductive system. He explains how vulnerable the testicles are because they're outside the body. And he talks about the risks of conditions like testicular torsion and hernias.
The testicles are located in the scrotum outside the body, and that helps with sperm production because sperm needs a slightly cooler temperature. But being outside the body makes them more prone to injury.
He tells a story about treating a young patient with testicular torsion, where the spermatic cord gets twisted. It shows how important it is to seek medical attention right away to prevent permanent damage.
Testicular torsion, it's a surgical emergency. If you don't treat it quickly, the twisting cuts off blood flow to the testicle, and that can lead to tissue death and even infertility.
Dr. Rajan also talks about how delicate the structure of the penis is. And it's surprising to learn that, yes, it can actually fracture.
Penile fracture, it's not common, but it's a serious injury. It can happen if the erect penis is bent forcefully, and it can damage the tissues that are responsible for getting an erection. Often, it needs surgery to fix.
It makes you realize that you have to be careful, even during intimate moments. And speaking of intimacy, Dr. Rajan doesn't shy away from the risks of the female reproductive system. He covers things like UTIs, sexually transmitted infections, and the challenges of childbirth.
The female reproductive system is intricate and susceptible to different infections. Practicing safe sex and getting medical help if you notice any unusual symptoms, that's crucial for maintaining your reproductive health.
He explains how the menstrual cycle works, the role of the placenta during pregnancy, and the unique challenges that women face during childbirth.
The menstrual cycle, it's a complex interplay of hormones that prepares the body for pregnancy. If pregnancy happens, the placenta develops to provide nourishment to the fetus. And childbirth in humans, it's particularly difficult because of the size of the baby's head compared to the birth canal.
He even mentions the risks of ectopic pregnancies, where the fertilized egg implants outside the uterus. It highlights how many things can go wrong during pregnancy and why prenatal care is so important.
Ectopic pregnancies, those are serious and can be life-threatening if they're not diagnosed and treated quickly. If an ectopic pregnancy ruptures, it can cause internal bleeding, and that requires immediate medical attention.
And let's not forget about the bladder. It's an organ that we don't think about much until it's causing us problems. But it plays a vital role in removing waste from our bodies. Dr. Rajan points out that it can also be a source of trouble, from those UTIs to the pain of kidney stones.
The bladder, it's like a muscular sac that stores the urine produced by the kidneys. It's important to empty your bladder regularly to prevent infection and other complications. And kidney stones, those are hard deposits that form in the kidneys. They can cause a lot of pain when they move through the urinary tract.
He gives some advice on preventing kidney stones, like drinking enough fluids and changing your diet to reduce the risk.
Drinking plenty of fluids, especially water, it helps dilute your urine and makes it less likely for crystals to form, which is what leads to kidney stones. And certain dietary changes, like reducing your sodium intake and increasing citrate, those can help too.
It just shows that even the seemingly insignificant functions of our bodies can have a big impact on our health. But let's shift gears one last time and talk about something that often makes people uncomfortable: death.
Death is a natural part of life, but it's a subject that many people find hard to talk about. Dr. Rajan approaches it with sensitivity and insight. He uses his experiences as a surgeon to explore what it means to die.
He starts by talking about his early experiences as a doctor, certifying deaths. He talks about how deeply those experiences affected him. It's a reminder that even healthcare professionals, who see death all the time, they still struggle with the emotional weight of it.
Seeing someone die, especially as a healthcare provider, it can take a toll on you emotionally. It's important for people in healthcare to have support and resources to help them deal with the emotional burden of their work.
Dr. Rajan goes through the history of how humans have tried to understand and conquer death, from ancient rituals to modern medicine. It shows how fascinated we are by death, a fascination that spans centuries.
Throughout history, we've tried to figure out what happens when we die and how to live longer. From ancient burial practices to the latest medical advancements, our pursuit of immortality has taken many forms.
He explains the difference between clinical death, when the heart stops beating and breathing stops, and biological death, the point when all brain activity stops.
Clinical death, unlike biological death, can sometimes be reversed. With today's medical technology, we can bring people back who have experienced clinical death. But once biological death happens, there's no bringing someone back.
It's an interesting distinction. Makes you think about what consciousness is and where the line is between life and death. Dr. Rajan even describes what happens when a body decomposes, the role of bacteria in breaking it down, and the different stages of that natural process.
Decomposition is a natural process that starts soon after death. Bacteria are key players in breaking down tissues, releasing gases and fluids that give decomposition its characteristic smell.
It might not be the most pleasant topic to think about, but it reminds us of the natural cycle of life and death. And speaking of death, Dr. Rajan ends the book with a powerful message, encouraging readers to consider donating their bodies to science.
Donating your body to science is incredibly generous. It can benefit so many people. It lets medical students study anatomy, helps surgeons improve their techniques, and gives researchers the opportunity to learn more about the human body.
It's a fitting way to end a book that celebrates both the amazing things and the vulnerabilities of the human body. It reminds us that even in death, our bodies can still contribute to the advancement of medical knowledge. It really is a powerful idea, changing how we think about healthcare. Instead of just reacting to illness, we can focus on actively creating wellness.
That kind of shift, it could make a huge difference in how long we live and how well we live those years.
Absolutely. Something to strive for. So to wrap up our deep dive into This Book May Save Your Life, I want to leave you with a question that really got me thinking. Dr. Rajan, he makes such a strong case for donating our bodies to science after we die. It's an incredible gift, so selfless, and it helps so many others. But what if we could take that generosity and apply it to ourselves while we're still alive?
That's an interesting thought. What do you mean by extending that generosity to ourselves?
Well, what if we treated our own bodies with the same kind of reverence and respect that we would a donated cadaver? What if every choice we made, we acknowledged those intricate systems that keep us going?
I like that analogy. Instead of seeing our bodies as, I don't know, disposable, we could see them as these precious gifts that deserve our best care and attention.
Exactly. It's about making choices that nourish us physically, that challenge us mentally, and that cultivate a sense of gratitude for this incredible gift of life. It's realizing that our health, it's not just up to fate, it's the result of all the little decisions we make each day.
It's about taking control of our well-being, not just waiting to see what happens, but actively shaping our own health.
As you go through your day, think about this. What choices can you make that honor your body and how amazing it is? What little acts of kindness can you show yourself today and every day to live a healthier, more vibrant life?
That's a question worth considering. Those small, consistent actions, they can really add up and make a big difference in how we feel.
Thanks for joining us on this journey through This Book May Save Your Life. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and keep exploring those wonders within yourselves and the world around you.